You'd have to be crazy to commit the kinds of crimes that Jeffrey Dahmer went to prison for. So how was he declared legally sane? Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991, after one of his would-be victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment and alert a pair of passing police patrolmen. After Edwards led the officers to the apartment from which he had escaped, they discovered Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies. Initially, Dahmer tried to resist arrest, but he was quickly overpowered. As police searched the apartment, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Despite his trying to evade capture after police uncovered his crimes, Dahmer later offered full cooperation with the police in interviews, choosing to speak without a lawyer present and to lay out all of his recollections of his brutal slayings. He was also entirely open concerning the monstrous sexual acts he committed to the remains. While assisting police in identifying his victims, according to Brian Masters' The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer, he said, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." Dahmer also assisted by admitting his guilt in the courtroom, meaning that rather than the jury being tasked with ascertaining his guilt or not, their role was to determine whether he was sane, and therefore responsible for his actions when he committed them. Dahmer's trial featured testimony from expert psychiatrists who had interviewed the serial killer to provide evidence to the jury. It was the jury's difficult task to ascertain whether Dahmer was indeed certifiably sane, despite the severity of his actions. The psychiatrists diagnosed Dahmer with 4 personality disorders that underpinned his actions. As the Washington Post reported, the personality disorders themselves didn't amount to his being insane in the legal sense. For that to happen, 10 of the jurors would have to agree that either Dahmer was unable to tell whether his actions were morally wrong or was unable to prevent himself from doing them as a result of a mental disease. However, his disorders weren't considered mental diseases that would affect him in such a way. With details of his case including his use of subterfuge to dupe police officers, showing that he had the power of self-control when required. Dahmer was also a selective killer whose crimes were committed with a high degree of premeditation. Indeed, the report notes that despite attempting to plead insanity, his defense team's efforts were hampered by Dahmer's own admission that he knew his actions were wrong, meaning that their only chance to convince the jury that he was insane was to show he could not prevent himself from killing. Milwaukee County District Attorney A. Michael McCann said at the time, "The tragedy here is I think he could have stopped at any time."
This defendant never again has the opportunity to walk the streets of our community.
In a piece written for Psychology Today, psychologist Travis Langley explains why the jury in the Jeffrey Dahmer case came to their decision. While many Americans surely wanted to see Dahmer face justice for his crimes, those crimes didn't immediately inspire notions of sanity. Many would have found his actions to be the very definition of insanity. But the laws around guilt and insanity verdicts are difficult to secure in court. Those laws were largely influenced by John Hinckley Jr.'s failed assassination attempt against President Ronald Reagan. That court case resulted in proving insanity in court much more difficult. So by the time Dahmer was being sentenced, he didn't meet the criteria. Ironically, Hinckley's crime, which was found to have been driven by delusions, was considered the work of an insane man. But Dahmer's more disturbing and horrifying crimes weren't. Had Jeffrey Dahmer been found criminally insane, it is highly probable that he wouldn't have been sent to prison, but rather would have been housed at a maximum security psychiatric hospital, where he would have received treatment with the possibility of being released once he was deemed to have been cured. Instead, he was housed at Portage, Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. There he was kept with other killers, many of whom remained dangerous behind bars. On November 28, 1994, 2 years after he'd been sentenced to life imprisonment for 15 murders of young men and boys, Dahmer, who was then 34, was bludgeoned to death by inmate Christopher Scarver when they were left unsupervised in the prison gym. Though some of the relatives of Dahmer's victims reportedly celebrated news of Dahmer's death, others felt that he had evaded justice, with one mother stating, "The hurt is worse now because he's not suffering like we are." Whether Dahmer would have remained alive, was he housed in a mental institution rather than prison, is something we will never know.